Well, hello and welcome to another online Bible study with Pastor Bill Brown, Carmichael Baptist Church. This is in lieu of our morning worship service, and we are continuing on in our series on the Gospel and the books of Moses. This is number 29. For 28 weeks, I have shared with you the Gospel from the books of Moses, and we've looked at all 5 of these books and found Jesus and the gospel just as we were promised. Now, if you remember Jesus himself, when he was having that conflict with the Pharisees, said, if you'd have believed Moses, you'd have believed me, because Moses, wrote of me. And we found him. We looked and we discovered him. In fact, if you look with me again, kind of in review, just to let you know, this is our final in this series. So number 29 is it. We could go further. There are more messages to be found, but just feel led to be able to conclude here. But if you remember, we started out in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, where it talked about the seed of the woman. And we're going to review, I'm going to list almost everything that I mention, but there'll be a few that I don't list. It's going to fill up the screen, and you'll see that. But we began in Genesis with the promised seed of the woman. We went on and looked at and found him in the coats of skin. We saw him in the firstlings that Abel brought in the offering, and then, of course, in the fat portions thereof. We saw him in the blood of Abel, and we saw him in the altar that Noah built, and then we saw him in the ark that Noah built. We saw him and the gospel and the covenant that was made with Abraham, and we saw him in the offering, of course, of his son Isaac, and of course in the ram caught in a thicket. We saw him in the life of Abraham and in the priesthood of Melchizedek. We saw him as well in the lives of Jacob, of Joseph, and in the life of Isaac. And we also, of course, that Abrahamic covenant was renewed with both Jacob, Joseph, and Isaac as well. Then we saw him in the burning bush. We saw him in the Passover lamb. If you remember, we saw him in the feast of unleavened bread. We saw him in the heavenly manna. We saw him in the rock that was smitten, and how that the water came out and gave every one of the Israelites to drink, including their animals. We saw him in the law that was given on Mount Sinai. Never forget that Paul called the law our schoolmaster, which brings us to Christ. We saw him also in the furniture of the tabernacle. We saw him there in the altar, the brazen altar. We saw him in the brazen laver. We saw him in the altar of incense. We saw him in the tabernacle itself. And then in the table of showbread. Well, let me get around there where I get the right ones in order. The table of showbread. We saw him in the Ark of the Covenant. And we saw him in the mercy seat. We also saw him in a lot of offerings. I'll mention some of those a little bit later as well, but I'm going to mention groups of them in the burnt offering, in the sin offering, and in the peace offering. And we saw him in the wave offering and the grain offering, as well as the guilt offering and the drink offering. We also saw him in the laying on of hands, if you remember, in the confessing of sins, and him being our substitute, which meant then too we saw him in the slaying of the animals and in the sprinkling of the blood upon the altar. We saw him in the Lord's goat and in the scapegoat. We saw him in the burning of the fat, and we most certainly saw him in the Day of Atonement. We saw him as well in the anointing oil, in the laws of purification, and bless God, we even saw him in the laws of the ashes of the red heifer. We also saw him in the gospel in the year of Jubilee. We were blessed to be able to see him in the redemption of the donkey, or redeeming the donkey and redeeming the firstborn. We also saw him in the kinsman redeemer and in the kinsman avenger. Remember too that we saw him in the cities of refuge. I'm going to list all of those out, but there's where I can say too, we could expand this list. There isn't enough room to mention all of the daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly offerings, but we will at least mention we saw him in the Feast of Weeks. We could mention also the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Booths, but we'll stop with that and just say that we remember him too in the brazen serpent, in Aaron's rod that budded, and in the priest of Phinehas. And then we also saw him in the last picture of the accursed of God who was hung on a tree. And then we also saw him in the promised prophet, the one that would be greater than Moses. Now, with all of those, and you can see the list is long, and that's not a complete list. There were over, I think, 55 different pictures of the gospel. And last week we saw the closeness and the clarity of the gospel in all of these types and all of these pictures. And then we talked about the verse that says, listen, it's right there near you. It's in your mouth. It's in your heart. This wasn't presented as a mystery. I think how much more people get excited when you tell them we're going to expose a mystery, something that's been hidden for thousands of years. And people will listen intently, and they'll listen, and usually it's a big con. You know, something that's been missing for years, the gospel's never been missing. The gospel's never been a mystery. The gospel's never been a puzzle. It was presented, and you can see my list with clarity and with closeness. And today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at, hopefully, and encourage you that have seen him, those that have heard him, and those who have with their hearts believed him and heard his voice. Have you seen the gospel? Have you heard the gospel? Have you believed the gospel? Then today you are ready for the final verse that we're going to look at in the book of Deuteronomy, and it's going to lead us right into our next series where we're going to see who it is that we're going to be led into the promised land by. We are ready to be confident warriors led by Joshua, just another name for Jesus, into the promised land. So today, my dear friends, you are ready to hear about the promise of his presence. If you've heard him, if you've seen him, if you've believed in the gospel of Jesus Christ, then I want you to open your Bibles up to Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 6 through 8, and we're going to read one verse at a time that's there, and I want you to see how precious this, in fact, it really is, where he says, first off, be strong and of good courage. Fear not, nor be afraid of them, for the Lord thy God, he it is that doth go with thee. He will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. And then verse 7, and Moses called unto Joshua, and said unto him in the sight of all Israel, be strong and of good courage, for thou must go with this people unto the land which the Lord hath sworn unto their fathers to give them, and thou shalt cause them to inherit it. And the Lord, he it is that doth go before thee. He will be with thee. He will not fail thee, neither forsake thee. Fear not, neither be dismayed. Now, if you look at the context of this, of course, and it leads us again right into the book of Joshua, but Moses is preparing Israel, and he's preparing Joshua for his death. He's preparing them for the passing of leadership from Moses to Joshua, and he leaves them with these words and with this promise, the promise of his presence, the promise that God will never fail you and he'll never forsake you. Do you know that the writer of Hebrews uses these very same words in a very practical manner in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5, where he's writing there, let your conversation or your manner of life or your living be without covetousness, and be content with such things as ye have, for he hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. Again, think about that. Joshua is about to succeed Moses, and he's going to lead that nation of Israel into the promised land. And they're going to need this promise. They're going to need to be reminded of these words, to be strong and of good courage. Joshua will need it because he's got some battles to fight. He's got some battles to face. And I want to give you just a brief overview of them for just a minute. If you think about the battles of Joshua, and by the way, let me give you this. We sing it a lot of times of crossing the Jordan River and that the promised land is some type of heaven. My dear friends, I'm not going to be fighting any battles in heaven. When I cross the Jordan River, so say if it's death, it is not to go in and fight some battles. But I will say that the crossing of Jordan is a type of death. It's a type of death that we must die to self, that we must crucify that old man and prepare for the battles that lie ahead in this life as we follow Jesus, as we begin to obey and go into our lot. That's what they were doing. They were going to go into their inheritance, that lot that would be divided to them. We're not going to fight battles in heaven, but we will fight battles here. If you remember, the first battle was Jericho. Then they fought and lost a battle in Ai. But that was their only recorded loss. Later they won at Ai and then at Bethel. So we see the first three that are there. Then we can go through and read how that Joshua led them to fight and win against the Amorites, against King Makeda, and then at Lebna, Lachish, Gezer, Eglon, Hebron, and Debir. He also led them to fight against a federation that belonged to King Hazar, the king of Madon, the king of Shimron, and the king of Ashraf. Interesting little list that you'll find in there too, and I'm not going to give you the scriptures right now, but it talks about how that Joshua fought with the kings of the mountains, of the plains, and in the valley, and even in the borders of Dor in the west. When you look at that list, the mountains, the plains, the valleys, and the borders, that pretty much covers all the geographical regions that you can encounter. In other words, every place that we're going to encounter in our life, whatever we might encounter, there's where we can find a lesson to learn of how to fight, how to depend upon the Lord. Lastly, you're going to learn how that he fought the Amorites, and of course that's already listed above. But I wanted to make mention of it because of the Amorites. Then you find him fighting the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Hivites, and of course then King Hazar and several other kingdoms, as well as the Anakims. They fought. In fact, what you're going to find out is Joshua was obedient to the Lord. Moses commanded him, and Joshua obeyed because that command came from the Lord. In fact, look at Joshua 11 and 15. It says, as the Lord commanded Moses, his servant, so did Moses command Joshua, and so did Joshua. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord commanded Moses. He picked it up and carried on with what the commandments were. He went in the power of that promise and in the power of the presence of the Lord. I love this. Go back again and look at Deuteronomy 31 and verse 6. Again, be strong and of a good courage. Fear not, nor be afraid of them. For the Lord thy God, he it is that doth go with thee. He will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. Now, they had a loss right off the bat almost, didn't they? But that wasn't the Lord's fault. They'd forgot about him. But you see, the reason why we can look at this is your promise of the gospel. This is your promise of the presence of the Lord in the battles that you're going to have to face in living the life that he's called you to live. This is the promise of the gospel, the promise of his presence. Joshua really begins your story after seeing, hearing, receiving, and believing the gospel that God hath raised up Jesus from the dead. It's right there. It's close. It's near you. It's in your mouth. You're ready to believe. You're ready to follow. And that's what I'm challenging you to do. It's said that Joshua fought 31 different kings. You see that list that's there. And in Joshua 11 and 8, it says Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. Someone has calculated it out that it was 7 years that he fought. 7 long. You know what we do? We don't like to fight for a long time. We don't want to have that struggle. Well, I think 7 years is a lot better than 40 years of wandering around in the wilderness, don't you? I'd rather not wander in the wilderness for 40 years. I'd rather fight for 7 years. You see, you have to realize that your battle in this world will not be short, and it will not be easy. That number 7 is a number of perfection. And if we will follow the Lord into battle, we don't war with the flesh. We war with principalities and powers and rulers of darkness. And even going back, if you look at Jericho and Ai, those first 2 battles of Israel, they really tell the story. And they tell our story. If you leave the fight of faith to the power of God, you too will be victorious. But if you presume upon God like they did with Ai, if you disobey God by snatching up the things out of Jericho that you shouldn't have and hold on to the riches which belong to God, then you're going to face defeat. You know, you can think about it, look back at Jericho, and we will in our coming series. They won that first battle against the oldest and most fortified city of Canaan, Jericho. And they did it without raising anything more than a foot, their voices, and their trumpets. And they didn't speak at all for a while. They were quiet and told to be quiet. They obeyed some very seemingly strange orders that came from the Lord. But they won that battle. Everybody is amazed. We sing songs about the Battle of Jericho. But then you think about Ai, they lost that battle against one of the weakest and the smallest cities because of their disobedience and their presumptive trust in self. Oh, we don't need to prepare. They're so little. We don't need to worry about them. Well, you know, folks, we do need to be concerned with listening to the Lord and following the Lord exactly as he calls us. Also, I'm going to tell you, you're going to find, and when we go through that series, that they did leave themselves and their children some future problems because they failed to drive out all of the people that God told them to drive out. Now, You and I need to conquer every bit of our flesh. And as you go through life, you're going to learn that every time you seem to get over one hump and you win one battle of the flesh, you're going to have to fight another battle of the flesh. And you cannot give up on any of them. You've got to drive them all out. It's a picture of our own lives and how we cannot leave any of our old nature alive. I know it because I'm a man just like you're a human being, and we like certain things. We love certain things, and we don't like to give them up. But by doing so, we run the risk just like Israel did. Let me remind you again of what Hebrews 13:5 said. He says, let your conversation, that's your manner of life, be without covetousness. And be content with such things as you have. For he has said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. You know, I want you to think about that a little bit. We need to realize the promise of his presence. We need to realize the promise of victory and even provision that's there. We need to realize the promise of his peace and the promise of contentment. It is all found in him. It's all found in the gospel of Jesus Christ. The writer of Hebrews is saying, don't look for your life to be filled with the things of this world. Look for your life to be filled with the presence, the power, the peace, and the contentment that comes from God. Hunger for his fellowship, not the riches of this world. Hunger for fellowship with brothers and sisters of Jesus Christ rather than the friends of this world. The Israelites were not supposed to leave a single enemy alive, just like you and I are not. We are to crucify. Mortify, therefore, the deeds of the flesh. We are not to leave any part of our old nature alive. Our manner of living, our affections, and our actions. Let your conversation, your manner of living, your affections, and your actions be without covetousness. Don't lust for the things of this world. The things that are temporary are just that. They're temporary. But the things that are eternal are eternal. What is your delight? What is your joy? Where do you find happiness and satisfaction? Jesus said in Luke chapter 12 and verse 15 that as man's life does not consist in the abundance of things. And yet what do we often find ourselves longing for? Things. Rather than longing for things, let your conversation be without covetousness and be content with such things as you have. The Apostle Paul said, I have had to learn how to be content. For he has said again, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. That's the promise. Where do we find victory? We find it in the promise of God. In the very same promise that Joshua had. Let me show you what Joshua had in chapter 1 and verse 5, just as a teaser before we get into that series beginning next week. He says, there shall not any man, here's the promise, look at this. There shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with thee. I will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. Now, Joshua's enemies were real. He had real armies, real cities, all that needed to be conquered. But not a single one of them could stand before him. Why not? Because of God's promise. He promised, I won't fail you. I'll never forsake you. I'll be right there. Well, the same truth is ours in a spiritual manner. No spiritual enemy can stand victorious against us. We can bring down those strongholds. A greater one than Moses is with us, and we have the promise of his presence because we have heard, seen, and believed the gospel. Now, I've spent 7 months, at least in our church. You may have listened to them. All of them, it wouldn't take you that long, but we've spent 7 months looking at and finding Jesus in the books of Moses. We've seen the gospel. We've received the gospel. And now we stand in the gospel. We can look at the promise of his presence and rejoice. Now we will look at the book of Joshua, and we will be led by Joshua, or if you will, by Jesus, because that's the Greek rendering of that name. And Jesus will lead us on our path through the next several weeks of study, and here's what we will see. We will see the course of the gospel. We will see the conquest of the gospel, and we will see the confidence of the gospel. And I could add, we will also learn the contentment of the gospel. I encourage you, be excited with me. Come and join us in our study in the book of Joshua and how we will look at that book with New Testament eyes and see Jesus again and see the promise of his presence as we fight the battles in this life that we have to face and how the victory can be yours. I pray that the past 29 weeks have been a blessing to you and that you'll come join us for the next several weeks as we look into the book of Joshua. Lord bless you. Hope we see you again.